Hey John, I posted a comment under your video saying where I agreed, where I'd qualify a little bit, and I wanted to read a little passage from Human, All Too Human by Nietzsche about morality and good and evil. Like I said in my comment, relativism is it's something that I've grown to hate, um, or at least try to shy away from using or relying on myself. And I kind of get aggravated when I see other people using it because it just throws everything up in the air. And I think the kind of relativism you're talking about is something that Nietzsche would disdain as well. The sense that humbleness and meekness is a virtue, um, which may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes we need a strong hand to do um, what is, in the end, the most compassionate thing. But I'm going to read, I believe this is chapter 39 of Human, All Too Human, or page 39. The history of those feelings by virtue of which we consider a person responsible, the so-called moral feelings, is divided into the following main phases. At first, we call particular acts good or evil without any consideration of their motives, but simply on the basis of their beneficial or harmful consequences. Soon, however, we forget the origin of these terms and imagine that the quality good or evil is inherent in the actions themselves, without consideration of their consequences. This is the same error language makes when calling the stone itself hard, the tree itself green. That is, we take the effect to be the cause. Then we assign the goodness or evil to the motives and regard the acts themselves as morally ambiguous. We go even further and cease to give to the particular motive the predicate good or evil, but give it rather to the whole nature of a man. The motive grows out of him as a plant grows out of the earth. So we make man responsible in turn for the effects of his actions, then for his actions, then for his motives, and finally for his nature. Ultimately, we discover that his nature cannot be responsible either, in that it is itself an inevitable consequence, an outgrowth of the elements and influences of past and present things. That is, man cannot be made responsible for anything, neither for his nature, nor his motives, nor his actions, nor the effects of his actions. And thus we come to understand that the history of moral feelings is the history of an error called responsibility, which in turn rests on an error called freedom of the will. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, concluded as follows: because certain actions produce displeasure, or a sense of guilt, a responsibility must exist. For there would be no reason for this displeasure if not only all human actions occurred out of necessity, as they actually do according to this philosopher's insight, but if man himself also acquired his entire nature out of the same necessity, which Schopenhauer denies. From the fact of man's displeasure, Schopenhauer thinks he can prove that man somehow must have had a freedom which did not determine his actions, but rather determined his nature. Freedom, that is, to be this way or the other, not to act this way or the other. According to Schopenhauer, operare, or doing, the sphere of strict causality, necessity, and lack of responsibility, follows from esse, being, the sphere of freedom and responsibility. The displeasure man feels seems to refer to operare, doing, to the extent it is erroneous, but in truth it refers to esse, being, which is the act of a free will, the primary cause of an individual's existence. Man becomes that which he wants to be. His volition precedes his existence. In this case, we are concluding falsely that we can deduce the justification, the rational admissibility of this displeasure, from the fact that it exists. And from this false deduction Schopenhauer arrives at his fantastic conclusion of so-called intelligible freedom. But displeasure after the deed need not be rational at all. In fact, it certainly is not rational, for it rests on the erroneous assumption that the deed did not have to follow necessarily. Thus, because he thinks he is free, but not because he is free, man feels remorse and the pangs of conscience. Furthermore, this displeasure is a habit that can be given up. Many men do not feel it at all, even after the same actions that cause many other men to feel it. Tied to the development of custom and culture, it is a very changeable thing, and present perhaps only within a relatively short period of world history. No one is responsible for his deeds, no one for his nature. To judge is to be unjust. This is also true when the individual judges himself. The tenet is as bright as sunlight, and yet everyone prefers to walk back into the shadow and untruth for fear of the consequences. So, this idea that no one is responsible for their deeds, that no one's responsible for their nature, no one can judge another without being unjust. I think maybe from the perspective that you were drawing on in this video, John, that you would think that that is evil. But maybe it's beyond good and evil, and that not succumbing to the duality allows us not to judge ourselves or others. I gotta get that call.